Well,
Anyway, we'll talk to Kevin, then we'll talk to Kai. Sorry, Kai.
I'll do that. Kevin in Georgia, pronouns are he, him, says, I don't think Matt holds himself to the same standards as he does everyone else regarding the burden of proof. Wow. Okay. How are you, Kevin?
Attack.
Hey guys, I'm doing pretty good. I know there's a little short period of time. There's two things I wanted to talk about, but
sure. But let's. I'm gonna put you on the clock in just a second. But you think that I have a different standard for me with regard to the burden of proof than for everybody else. Make your case. Go ahead.
Okay. Just to be exact, I've listened to a lot of clips and I've watched a lot of videos when people are trying to make their case for God. And, you know, you'll go into how did you demonstrate that, different things like that, and ask valid questions and make very valid points. Then there's been times where you'll have a back and forth with a theist and you'll deliberately say that their God is fake or their God is not real. And even though I know I've only got a minute, I just want to say this was more of a question as to, are you doing that in the heat of the moment, or do you believe what you actually say? Because if you're making a claim like that, don't you have to substantiate your claim too? Because you've said that numerous times when you're going back and forth with somebody that because your God's a fairy tale or your God is fake or he's not real. That's different from your position when you've said that you're not convinced or, you know, you don't have good reason, which I completely understand the difference between that and saying complete disbelief. Do you understand my question? It's a literal question.
I absolutely do, and I can answer it, and you're absolutely correct. If I run around asserting that there is no God, I've adopted a burden of proof. That's a fact.
Okay.
If I run around saying the God that you believe in is fictional, I have adopted a burden of proof. And so if somebody asked me to demonstrate that, we would then have the discussion. But that's not what tends to actually happen. And so let me just ask you, do you think that Bigfoot is real?
No.
I'm not convinced that Bigfoot is real either. But if I were to say Bigfoot is fictional, I've now adopted a burden of proof, and I would then have to justify that. But there's also a colloquial sense where we start with the assumption of innocence until guilt is demonstrated. So there's a direction that needs to be demonstrated. I can sit here forever and say Bigfoot's bullshit, and I'm not going to prove anything, because I don't need to convince people that Bigfoot's bullshit. But what I'm saying, it does in itself carry with it a burden of proof. But the default position on the subject of whether Bigfoot is real is that Bigfoot should not be considered real until someone demonstrates that it is. There's a complete difference between saying X is true until we prove it false, or X should be considered false until we prove it true. This is why we have you are assumed to be innocent, even though you may not be, until they demonstrate guilt. And you could say, I'm convinced this person's innocent. You could say, I'm convinced this person's guilty. You could say, I'm convinced this person's not guilty, or I'm not convinced of guilt. So when I say something like, you know, it's actually kind of me prodding of, hey, your God's a fairy tale or fictional. That is me applying the burden of proof correctly on the existence claim, that until such time as you can demonstrate the truth of your claim, we are all rationally justified in acting as if your claim is not true. Not asserting that it's not true and then trying to demonstrate it, which we can do depending on people's different God definitions. But largely it's a colloquialism that says until you can demonstrate your God's existence, everybody is justified in believing that it doesn't exist. Clear?
Okay. I followed that.
Cool.
I just want to say I had a second point, but you guys have a list of other callers. So I'm going to let you go after this. I just wanted to say one more thing.
Sure.
The only reason I was so prone to bring that up is because I agree when you say I'm not convinced. Like, you know, some people find that a way of like dodging, but it's kind of like me with ghosts. I'm not saying ghosts aren't real, but I don't have any proof I'm not convinced they are. So I respect that position. But I've heard like yourself and like even, you know, Shannon say like, no, she does not believe God is real. And I just think if they're going to be.
Listen to the way you phrase that. Listen to the way you phrase that. You said you've heard us say we don't believe God's real. That is not the same. Saying I don't believe God's real is not the same as saying I believe God is not real. Those are two separate propositions.
Right. Right. Your example was what I used at the beginning, but like I said, what prompted me to call was just the other week I heard someone say that, no, I do not believe he's real. Right. And that's not exactly what came out of your mouth. But
I don't believe it's real. That's very different from I believe he's not real. Saying I don't believe he's real is different from saying I believe he's not real.
And when Shannon makes that claim, she's usually pretty good about following that up with, because nobody has provided a definition of God that is internally consistent. So she usually provides, and she's human, she's not going to do it all the time, but she actually does provide a rationale.
And by the way,
for what she says.
If we ever had to get into the positive atheism. So there's weak atheism, strong atheism. There's negative atheism, positive atheism. They're kind of the same thing, which is I'm not convinced a God exists. And then there's the positive one, which is I am convinced that no God exists. I'm not sure whether or not I'm convinced that no God exists. I go back and forth on it. But what I am sure of is that for the various gods that have been proposed by people, I'm pretty damn confident that they don't exist, because their existence and the things that are claimed about their character are in direct conflict with the observations that we make in reality. There is not, I assert that there is not a God who loves me and who wants me to know that he exists. If your God or anybody else's God is one where they love me and they want me to know he exists, that God does not exist, because any God would be able to clearly demonstrate to me instantly that they love me and that I now know they exist. And because that hasn't happened, the assertion that there is a God out there, what's preventing that God from revealing itself to me?
Well, I will agree with you 1,000% that the definition that is told to us, to the version of in church and everywhere else of who God is to be, and if you're saying that guy or whatever that is does not exist, I respectfully understand that.
Yeah. It's about specific definitions of God. When I say, if I ever say gods don't exist, I'm not talking about gods that I haven't heard of or that could exist in some multiverse or off to the side. This is about the gods that have actually people believe in. There's 7 billion plus people on the planet, and 3 or 4 billion of them believe in a God of some stripe, although they don't agree in the same one. None of the ones that have been proposed am I convinced they exist, and most of the ones that have been proposed, I'm convinced that they don't exist, and I can make a case for it, whether or not somebody accepts it. So yeah, I'm using the burden of proof the same for everybody. It's just that I'm not claiming something that's absolutely in conflict with reality. I'm saying until you show how your belief fits in reality, nobody's justified in believing it.
Okay. I'll call back on a different day of my other point so everybody else can get a turn. I appreciate it, guys.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin.